It had been 3 weeks since you had broken up with Peter. 3 long, painful weeks of trying to get over Peter while also being asked by what seemed to be the entire population of Midtown Tech, what happened? Most of them had been under the assumption you two hadn't been together for a while, but once they realized you had dropped him altogether, they couldn't help but ask. But your answer was always the same. We just grew apart. However, in a surprising turn of events, your saving grace ended up being Brad. As planned, the two of you met up the Saturday after you broke up with Peter, and the night had turned from completing the project to you venting about the breakup with Brad listening attentively. And the Monday after the breakup, Peter had stuck to your word and hadn't said a single syllable to you. In fact, he hadn't even glanced your way, which you hated to admit really fucking hurt. You knew what you said, but this just further proved your thought that he wasn't in love with you anymore. But nonetheless, no words were spoken to each other, which made your lunch period pretty awkward. Well, for you at least. Because you decided not to sit in your usual spot. MJ was out that day, so you ended up taking a seat at an empty table and ate your lunch by yourself, ignoring the glances Ned sent your way. You ate for about 10 minutes in silence before Brad had come over asking if he could sit with you. You easily agreed since you'd rather eat your lunch with someone than by yourself, and you did really enjoy Brad's company. It was also an excuse to get some more of your project done, but deep down you knew there was a part of you that just wanted to spite Peter. In the 3 weeks to come, you found comfort in MJ and Ned since they were still two of your best friends, but you also found yourself getting closer to Brad more and more. He was a breath of fresh air, and even after the two of you completed your history project, which you had ended up getting 100 on, he still wanted to spend time with you. Of course, you knew part of his reasoning was because he still had a bit of a crush on you, but you also knew that he just wanted to genuinely be your friend. He helped you through your breakup, and on certain days when you felt like you could barely get out of bed, he would end up skipping school entirely and making sure you were okay instead. You were in shock, really, how easily Brad was able to get your mind off Peter, and it was a great feeling for your mind not to be consumed by him anymore. The more time you spent with him during your lunch period, the more you noticed your eyes not being drawn to Peter anymore. So you actually ended up getting really close with Brad in those few weeks, closer than you ever thought you could be with him. Unfortunately, MJ caught on. She told you it was a dangerous game you were playing because she believed that you were going to end up using Brad as your rebound. But quite frankly, you didn't care. You weren't pursuing a relationship. You were going to him for comfort. And yes, maybe there were a few lingering touches and maybe there was some playful flirting, but you just broke up with Peter not that long ago and you weren't one of those girls that just moved on to the next guy. Well, at least that's what you believed. But quite honestly, it wouldn't hurt to have a boyfriend that treated you the same way Brad did. You were actually happy for once. Meanwhile, Peter on the other hand had been going through the motions after the breakup quite differently. But to put it simply, Peter just felt numb. He ignored the pain and immersed himself in the whole Spider-Man gig that much more. He spent his days patrolling from the minute he got out of school to the early hours of the morning. He ignored the breakup. He refused to think about it too long and bottled up all of his feelings on the matter. But he had to admit, he was a little worried about how easy it was to forget you. It made him finally acknowledge how little attention he had been giving you. But before he could think too much about it, he'd find a way to distract himself. Everyone around him had been worried with how he was dealing with the situation. He had been moody and would snap at anyone that even mentioned your name. May, Ned, and even MJ were concerned, but MJ tended to hide her concern better than the other two. Aunt May had been at a complete loss. She had never expected Peter to act the way he did when the two of you broke up. But the problem was that he was never home long enough for her to sit him down and just talk about it. And if there was time, he'd always shrug her off. She had been so worried about Peter that she even started losing sleep. She knew he was bottling up his feelings and she was terrified for the day he would burst and finally have to deal with the heartbreak, and by then it may be too late, even if he realized he just wanted you in his life as a friend again. Every lunch period those 3 weeks had been dark. MJ usually sat with you and Brad, but every now and then she'd sit with Ned and Peter. Ned tried to talk about anything he could think of, but it was hard since the two felt a very obvious weight over each conversation. Whenever Ned tried to talk about the breakup, he was met with, "I'm fine, Ned," and he'd eventually just end up having a one-sided conversation about Star Wars or Legos while Peter just hummed in acknowledgement. Ned had been trying his hardest to be a good friend to Peter, but every now and then he just had to bring you up. He could see how Peter was pushing the problem away, and seeing how he refused to acknowledge your existence worried him to death. You, Ned, and Peter had grown up together. You went to elementary school together and were unimaginably close. You and Ned were there when Uncle Ben died, when he became Spider-Man, and every success and failure there was. And when you and Peter started dating, Ned was in awe of how strong your relationship was and just a tad bit jealous. So to see the way Peter tensed up even by just mentioning a memory that you were a part of, not even explicitly saying your name, worried him to no end. Peter hadn't even told him how the breakup went. Instead, he had to go to you to finally find out what happened. And Ned knew that it wasn't about him, but he really missed you. Because once again, you were all best friends. He would have sat with you at lunch, but he felt like he had to be with Peter because of his strange behavior. Besides, he saw Brad and MJ making sure you were okay, so he wasn't so worried about your well-being. Ned knew you'd be okay. He made sure to continue to talk and text you, but truthfully, Ned had been a little depressed from how your friend group just collapsed in one day. And MJ, on the other hand, had just sat back for the most part and did what she does best and observed the two of you. She watched how differently the two of you handled the breakup and gave little advice besides the few warnings she gave you about Brad, saying, "Playing with fire, you know. You and Peter just broke up and you're getting awfully close with Brad," which you always ignored, waving off her comments. She watched as you sought refuge with another boy. Part of her believing that you just missed the kind of attention Peter gave you. And here Brad was, practically doing the same things a boyfriend does, so you stuck to him. And she watched how Peter was probably months, weeks, days, hours, or minutes from self-destructing when she actually took the time to realize that he really lost one of his best friends and the only girl he's ever fallen in love with. But then again, she could be wrong. Maybe you and Brad would actually get together and make a lasting relationship. And maybe Peter was just trying to get over you, and maybe not talking about you was just his way of working through his emotions by himself. Because after all, MJ was only 67% sure she was right. But still, 67% was still more than half. And she was really getting fed up with how Peter had been behaving towards everyone, and she was finally going to put a stop to it once and for all. MJ slammed her hand down on the lunch table, making both Ned and Peter jump. It was Friday, which marked the 3-week anniversary since the breakup, and it also happened to be one of those days where MJ decided to sit with the boys. It was clear that Peter knew it was now 3 weeks since the incident, since he was even quieter than usual. MJ was already exhausted from the mundane conversation Ned was trying to have with Peter, who was clearly not listening to a single word that he had been saying. So she hit the table, making Ned effectively shut up while also gaining both of their attention. MJ pointed a finger at Peter. "You," she simply said. Peter raised an eyebrow. "Me? Yes. You." "Okay. What about me?" "You have been depressing the fuck out of everyone, even more than I do, and quite frankly, I'm over it." Ned's eyes widened. "MJ!" "Shh!" She shushed sharply, turning to Ned. "I'm talking to Peter." She looked back at Peter. "You have 2 options, Parker. You're either going to make up with Yasmin, or finally talk about the breakup and then make up with her." Peter scowled, looking down at his lunch. "There's nothing to talk about." "Bullshit." "MJ, just drop it," he said in a cold, hard voice. "No!" she snapped. "The two of you dated for 3 fucking years. There's something to talk about. I don't know if it's because you feel guilty about what happened or you're just that stubborn, but you have been an absolute hell to talk to these last few weeks, and I'm over it." Peter rolled his eyes. "Then why don't you just go and sit with her from now on?" "Peter, you can't even say Yasmin's name." "Fine," he snapped, cutting her off. "You want me to talk about it? Then fine, I'll talk. I don't love her anymore. And when she broke up with me, I was expecting it to hurt a lot more than it did, and I don't know what's wrong with me, but I just didn't care as much as I should have. I never even cried a single tear over her, and I don't know if it's because I keep distracting myself before I can, or I just don't genuinely care that much. And I know you guys think I'm crazy now because she was my best friend and I fell in love with her, but the truth is that I just don't care." MJ and Ned stared at Peter wide-eyed after he blew up. Ned furrowed his eyebrows. "But it's Yasmin," he said, not knowing how to comprehend Peter's feelings towards the entire situation. Ned practically had a front row seat to yours and Peter's relationship. He saw firsthand how in love the two of you were, and Ned, for the life of him, could not understand how Peter could sit there and say that he wasn't in love with you. "I know that, Ned, but I don't love her anymore," Peter sighed. "Not even as a friend?" Ned asked. He just shrugged. "She's making new friends now anyway," he muttered, referring to Brad. MJ narrowed her eyes at him. "You're such a dumbass." She was pissed. You were an amazing girl, and MJ will never understand how you ended up dating someone who turned out to be this awful to you. Thanks, he said sarcastically. I've lost my appetite. And with that, he stood up, swinging his backpack over his shoulder, and he stormed out of the cafeteria. Ned sighed. I'll go after him, he said, standing up. See you later, MJ. And with that, he chased after Peter. MJ groaned and turned around in her seat to see where you were sitting. When she saw that neither you or Brad were in your usual seats, MJ realized that she'd be eating lunch by herself today. Shit, she sighed, turning back to her lunch and grabbing her backpack to dig for her book. Peter walked down the hallway in anger. He didn't know where he was going, but he just needed to get away from MJ's interrogating. He could already hear Ned's footsteps chasing after him, but he ignored them. He was about to turn the corner when he stopped, hearing a very familiar voice. He already knew it was you by your giggle, and not wanting to see you, he was about to turn back around until he heard a second voice say nervously, "Oh God," they sighed. I don't really know how to say this, but I'm just gonna go for it. Peter recognized the voice to be Brad's, and now, out of sheer curiosity, he found his feet glued to the spot. Ned had finally reached Peter. Peter! Shh! He cut him off, making Ned shut up and look at him questioningly. Peter ignored him, though, and peeked his head around the corner, and just as he assumed, he saw both you and Brad standing across from each other in front of a trophy case. He stayed quiet as he watched the scene play out in front of him. Brad took a deep breath and said, I promise I'm not saying this to take advantage of you, but I really, really like you. I know I've already said this before, but I just needed to say it again. And if you don't like me back, that's completely fine. I know this may not have been the best time to tell you because of what you just went through, but I was just wondering if when you feel better, if maybe you'd like to go. I was quickly cut off by you leaning up on your tippy toes and quickly kissing his lips, pulling back a second later. Brad stood there wide-eyed, looking down at you, not believing if that had actually happened. You stood in front of him, face flushed, and gripped his hands in yours as you said, Brad, these last 3 weeks have been really hard for me, but you've helped me through it so far in unimaginable ways, and I may not be completely over it yet, but I'd be lying if I said I was opposed to dating you. Peters took a step back, not needing to hear the rest of the conversation. Ned watched Peter with furrowed eyebrows. He of course had heard the whole conversation as well, and right now was just watching Peter trying to process what he had just witnessed. Peter's stomach was reeling and there was an awful taste in his mouth, and a second later he was running back down the hallway past Ned into the nearest boy's bathroom. He practically ripped the door off his hinges, almost doing the same to one of the bathroom stall doors. And Peter found himself hunched over the toilet as he gagged and threw up into it. He panted and spit into the toilet, trying to get rid of the awful taste on his tongue. Peter leaned back, sitting against the stall door, out of breath. His chest, stomach, and head suddenly hurt, and he was finding it hard to breathe. It felt like his entire world was collapsing and crashing in on itself. This was it, he realized. Watching you and Brad together like that was what finally pulled his head out of his ass and made the numbness from the breakup wash away. And all that was left was pain that hurt worse than any injury he's ever sustained as Spider-Man, and he realized that yes, he was still fucking in love with you. Peter heard the bathroom door being pushed open and heard as Ned walked in, panting from running down the hallway. Peter, he started. Are you okay? Ned. Peter's voice came out small and broken, his voice cracking on the single syllable. I really fucked up.